Greetings and salutations. Welcome back to the Everything Astronomy podcast. Today, Michael, Tom, and I are joined by Michigan grad, Temu. He graduated from Michigan with a double major in English and theater, and now works as a professional photographer who, in the last couple of years, has taken up astrophotography. Today, we'll discuss Temu's background, how he got interested in astrophotography, as well as the many subtleties of astrophotography, and how you, as a listener, can get involved. If you're interested in today's discussion, you can find out more on his website, social media, and masterclasses, which we've linked below. Temu, welcome to the show. Thank you for reaching out to us. We're really excited to have someone like you on our show.
Thank you guys very much. I'm very excited to be here. I really look forward to speaking with any night sky enthusiasts, but particularly folks who are going to make it in part their career. It's a great pleasure to speak with you, and thank you for having me.
Absolutely. And as Joe mentioned previously, we want to get to know you better. And you said you're very involved in astrophotography, but of course you didn't start like that, given you studied both English and theater in college. And we were hoping that you could bring us through your early life a little bit and kind of where this inspiration came from.
Yeah, sure. So I'm originally from Michigan. I was born in Detroit, but my family was actually living in Saudi Arabia at the time, of all things. My father was a pilot, which is probably why I've always had a fascination with looking up at things and where maybe the original inspiration for the sky kind of came from. He was working for the airline in Saudi Arabia, and we were living there. And then my folks split up, and by that point, my grandparents had moved from Detroit, where I was born, to Ann Arbor. And so when my mom and my sister and I came back, we lived with my grandparents in Ann Arbor. And I grew up there from about 4.5 years old or so. My dad eventually moved back, and so we all spent time together in Michigan around Ann Arbor, and it was a great place to grow up. I absolutely loved it. So I'm sort of Ann Arbor born and bred, and Michigan is very, very deep in my heart. I went to school, high school at Community High School in Ann Arbor, which was great for me because not being really science-minded. It had a great science program, but it was an alternative education high school, kind of more for arts students in some ways, great jazz program, and scholastically a really good school, but not something the typical sort of American high school experience.
Right.
And that was really great for me. So that was sort of my pre-college years. I was much more of a kind of an art student, did a lot of theater, did a lot of music. I was fortunate, I think, in the fact that I was born at a time when, gosh, this sounds so old to say now, but like, I remember before internet, before cell phones, before that really took over everything. And yet I was young enough to be fluent in all that technology when it took over, basically.
Right.
So I felt really fortunate. I think that's one reason why astrophotography and the science behind it, I understand, and the technology behind it, I'm able to comprehend a little bit, is because although I was never really science-minded per se, I still had that basis and understanding and kind of an intuitive understanding of technology in a way that people, even if 5 years older than I am, don't necessarily have, because they just miss that cusp. And so I was very fortunate in that sense. And loved my time in Ann Arbor before school. It was great.
So I think one of the reasons why we decided to start this podcast was because all four of us felt that as we were going through high school, most people start off by being interested in science and in the sky because it's just kind of cool. Right. And then there comes a point where people kind of get turned off and then stop pursuing it. As someone who stopped pursuing it and in a way came back to it, why did you choose not to carry on with science when you were 16 or 18?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think when I was a kid, the thing I wanted to be was a marine biologist. And so that was sort of my dream job when I was a little kid. I was fascinated by nature, by plants and animals, primarily animals. I still love wild animals. I do a lot of photography, and one of my passions is wildlife photography. And I think in high school, I started to understand, and I probably should have been clearer before this, but I think I started to understand in high school that marine biology or working with animals wasn't just hanging around cool animals and getting to watch them do things. you know, that there was
Right.
a lot of study, there was a lot of lab work, there was going to be a lot of biology and, you know, in some ways chemistry and math that frankly, I didn't have an intuitive understanding for or a natural love for.
Hmm.
So I think realizing that that was part of it and that I was going to have to spend a ton of time doing other things before I got to do what I considered to be the really fun things that I wanted to do, which
Right.
probably would be field research. I think that for me was what stopped me really pursuing that. And you know, again, I can't remember which is left brain, right brain. I've never remembered which is supposed to be which there, but I just never had that sort of, you know, inherent understanding in science in the same way that I did English lit comprehension and the arts in that way. So, and I found it frankly a little bit intimidating, which I think it
Right.
is if you don't have that innate kind of understanding.
Hmm.
Yeah.
And then given that you grew up in the city of Ann Arbor with the University of Michigan right there, was it a natural choice to attend there for English and theater, or were you deciding on other schools, or how did you go about that, making that big decision?
No, well, for much as I say that I was not necessarily wanted a traditional experience in high school and I was more of an arts kid, I am the most diehard Michigan football fan and have been since I was a little kid. That the idea of going anywhere else when I was 17 was I didn't even consider it. I think if Michigan hadn't been a great school and I couldn't go to a great school with in-state tuition, I really would have looked at applying elsewhere. But I love Michigan so much I didn't really apply anywhere else. It was the only place I wanted to go, and weirdly, since my career ended up being in photography, specifically in travel, photographic travel, and primarily I work as a tour manager and trip designer, and I've been on the road for 12 years now. I'm actually very much a homebody. So staying in Ann Arbor, something that was familiar to me, where my best friends were, even though they weren't going to be going to school with me, was very sort of comforting for me. And so I didn't even apply anywhere else. So when I say my love of Michigan is very deep, I really do mean it. It's a school that holds a lot of meaning for me.
So then at Michigan, like we kind of mentioned, you decided, you know, you had this natural proficiency for English and theater. I mean, we're all STEM majors. Would you kind of like take us through what that kind of process was?
Yeah, I think, you know, theater was what I loved doing in high school. I loved performance of all kinds. And I applied and auditioned for the fine arts program, the BFA program at Michigan in theater. And I didn't get in my first year. I did actually get in my second year. But by that point, I had realized that the BFA program, I mean, these guys, they basically lived in black clothing in a theater their entire college career. That's really all they did. And they were very good. But I had realized at that point, having kind of been not forced into taking other things, but as part of my BA program, having to take things outside of English lit, theater, so on and so forth, that I really wanted something that was a little bit more well-rounded. And so for me, even though I got in my second year, I decided to stay in the BA theater program, which allowed me to take classes that were outside. So I would say that the English and theater degree basically probably shared about 70 to 80%. And then the theater was sort of a specialization of the other, you know, 20 to 30% of stuff was really just theater focused and not a whole lot on performance, but a lot on theory and understanding and the history and sort of movements and that sort of thing. It was very different from the science-based courses that I did take, and I did take a few. I took, non-human primate evolution, intro to astronomy, as a matter of fact, which was great. I'm trying to think of what else I took. Some Japanese lit history programs and classes. So nothing that was, you know, I never took like an EECS course or anything like that.
Oh, yeah.
It was just way above my pay grade. But something that dabbled here and there, you know, I tried to do. But even the intro to astronomy courses, I look back now, again, it was like I was much more interested in the Greek mythology and understanding the constellations. And then, you know, once they were sort of like wanted me to do spectral breakdowns of stars and this kind of thing, I was like, oh my goodness, I'm not sure I can handle this. So
Right.
That was a sort of my experience. And so I felt fortunate that I got to do at least a little bit that was outside of theater and English. And I made choices to make sure that I could continue to do that. So.
Did you at any point feel sort of pushed down one track in college? Because certainly for me, I'm interested in way more things than I have time to start. Well, that I
Exactly.
in my 4 years in college. I would love to be able to learn more about how languages work, and I would love to be able to learn about the Greek mythology and how that relates to the constellations and all of this stuff.
Right.
And I would love to learn about how people sell stuff in business school and things like that. And I find I'm only halfway through college, and yet I already feel that kind of the time pressure really settling in. Did you kind of feel pushed down the English and theater track in the same way that maybe I am feeling kind of pushed down the physics and maths track, or was that really something that you came to wanting to do after having taken a wide range of things?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think looking back on college now, I look back on it as a time when I was actually figuring out more of what I didn't want to do than what I necessarily wanted to do. And so that sounds like a negative viewpoint of it, but frankly, it wasn't. It was really instructive for me. So theater was something I always loved. And I think I went in because I loved the performance of it. I loved the applause at the end. You have this dream of being an actor, and I got into stand-up comedy later on as well. And I really liked all those aspects of it. And there wasn't anything that I had really encountered otherwise that I thought, maybe even that I had the confidence that I really wanted to do full time. And so I think a theater wasn't something I felt forced down. I would say that once you go down that path for a couple years, I think people are really scared to change. And I mean, this conversation branches out into a whole lot of things about how ridiculous it is that we have to pay so much for education,
Right.
and the rest of it, right? But once you put 2 years and $40,000 or $50,000 into something, right?
Yep.
All of a sudden, maybe I'd rather study this. It takes a lot of chutzpah to be able to just up and change and do that. And you probably are not in the financial position to just tack on another 1.5 or 2 years of school in order to, So in some ways, I think once you've made the decision, yes, you kind of feel forced into that. I was lucky in that, my parents never sort of said, heck, I got my degree in theater. They never, most parents probably would not choose that for their children. It's not the most useful degree in the world. But they never forced me into anything. And if I had made changes, they would have supported those changes. I don't know if they would have supported me in school for longer than 4 years. But I never really felt forced. It was something I wanted to do. But as I look back on it now, like I said, I think a lot of college was taking courses, and having experiences and finding out what I definitely didn't want my life to be about. And so that was also very informative for, post-college years, obviously, and deciding what you're going to do afterward.
Mm-hmm. And speaking of afterward, you go into college, growing up, everyone's asking you, like, what do you want to do when you're older? Like, oh, I want to be a fireman or a policeman. And going into college, you obviously have a more developed idea of what you want to do. So going into college, what did you want to do with an English and theater double major, and how did that kind of shift as you went through college and learned about all these things that you didn't want to do?
Yeah, the original idea was, of course, to become an actor. And I was never a musical theater major, but in what they call straight theater or in TV movies, this kind of thing. So that probably would have been the dream going in. As I moved through school, I became more heavily involved in stand-up comedy. So I had worked at a comedy club in Ann Arbor, the Ann Arbor Comedy Showcase, which was formerly on Liberty. I don't know if it's still there. But I had worked there as a waiter all through college. So Thursday, Friday, Saturday night, that's where I would be. And in my third year at school, which was actually my junior year abroad in London, I had taken a course as part of my degree year there in stand-up comedy and loved it and performed several times in London, and then came back, and my sort of senior year and the semester I spent after my senior year was really spent mostly performing around Ann Arbor, Detroit, and Windsor. And so after I graduated school, I moved to New York and wanted to pursue performance of some kind, but really wasn't that involved in theater. I was looking more at stand-up and doing stand-up comedy and that sort of thing. So, it's an interesting thing because theater degrees, it was an incredible experience for me, and I'm glad I did it. And I think had I really wanted 100% to go more for theater, probably the BFA would have been a better program for me to be in. But you've never ever gone to an audition. No one has ever gone to an audition and they've asked to see your transcript from school or what degree you got, right? Like, maybe it helps if you come from Yale or what have you, but can you act? Can you pull off this part? That's really the only thing that really matters. So in terms of getting a degree to help you in a career in theater or acting, the degree itself doesn't really matter all that much. I think, at least that's been my understanding of it. Maybe other professional actors would feel differently. For me, it was much more about understanding performance and that sort of thing. And so I pursued stand-up and I enjoyed it for a little while, but that is a cutthroat business. The entertainment business is a really tough business to be a part of. And I think in any career, you have to want it. Right? You need to want it 110%, but particularly in that one, there's so many people scrambling for the few opportunities that come up that you really have to dedicate yourself. And I wasn't quite dedicated enough, or maybe I just wasn't good enough. I'm not really sure. But either way, it was something that even after a relatively short period, maybe a year and a half in New York, I kind of realized that it probably wasn't going to happen. For me, or at least I really wasn't willing to work hard enough for it to happen. Let me put it that way.
And then did your passion for this stand-up comedy come from being in college and a professor saying something? Or did you say you grew up being like a class clown or someone was always laughing at because of your jokes?
No, I mean, I think, okay, well, so I was a pretty chubby kid growing up. And so I think anytime I wasn't necessarily made fun of a ton. I wasn't with the popular kids. I wasn't with the nerds, quote unquote. I kind of float in between everywhere. But when you're not one of like the cool kids and, whatever, I think, my defense to all that was to try and be funny, right? That was my way of kind of working around and ingratiating myself into groups and that sort of thing. And so comedy was always something that I had kind of fallen back on as something that would help me. But moreover, I loved stand-up. When I worked in the stand-up, growing up as a teen and this sort of thing, I loved stand-up comedy. Working in a stand-up club, I saw a little bit of the business and how it was actually run, and how stand-ups would change their sets, because I worked there for 3 years. So you see the same comedians come through, and the good ones were working material and changing things, and I really liked that. I also think the thing that I really enjoyed and was terrifying, simultaneously enjoyed and was terrifying about something like stand-up was the fact that you sink or swim totally on your own. And in theater and any other kind of performance, when you're working with a team, you could be a great actor, and if the director is terrible, the lighting is terrible, or if it's film, the DOP or what have you, the script is terrible. There's a lot of things that affect your performance. Whereas with stand-up, and it's just you. So, if your writing is terrible, it's because you wrote terrible jokes. And if you can't deliver the lines, it's because you can't deliver them, and that's your problem. And so you have complete control over it, which is great in one way, because you're not dependent on anyone else. But in another way, it is terrifying because there's no other help for you. You're up there all alone. And I kind of like that sink or swim mentality to the whole thing. And so I think that's what I found really appealing about stand-up. And as cliche as it is, there is something really nice about making people laugh. It's a lot of fun. You feel good about it because they're laughing at things that you wrote, but it's also just nice to see people having a good time and being in a good mood. A comedy club is, generally speaking, sometimes when too much alcohol gets involved, it can be a not fun place, but most of the time it's a really fun place to be. So that was a part that I really enjoyed about it. But like I said, unfortunately, it wasn't what I eventually moved into, and it's a terribly difficult business to break into.
Well, I think one of the by the looks of it, one of many people's hardest challenge at the beginning of their adult lives is finding what their passion is. and how they're going to go about pursuing that, as opposed to ending up in a kind of boring job and just kind of plodding along.
Right.
And I think most people hope that when they're in college or university, they're going to just somehow miraculously stumble upon this passion,
Yeah.
even though they're studying something that they thought they were interested in when they were 18. But then, given that so much changes in those 4 years, I think a lot of people leave college with as many open questions as they went into college.
Right.
And by the sounds of it, it took you a little bit of time to find photography, which is what you're doing full time now. So how did you end up in photography, and did you have any inkling early on that you would end up in photography, or is it just something you stumbled upon?
Yeah, so I came to photography really late in life. My mom had a camera and I enjoyed playing with it and this kind of thing, but I was never super into photography, but in myself, but I enjoyed photography quite a lot, particularly wildlife stuff, Nat Geo, National Geographic, I love magazines and that kind of thing. But I didn't really come to photography until much later. So, I got through it through a circuitous route. Like a lot of people come to their passion, they don't necessarily wind up at it directly. By the way, I am jealous of those people that just know what they want to do from the get-go, and like they are just 100%. This is what I want out of life, and they go for it. There's a jealousy that I have of being that certain and just knowing. So, because as much as I love travel and photography, which is what I do, there's 1,000 other things I would like to do at some point as well. I'm still kind of scattershot with all that, but. After school, I came out to New York, did stand-up comedy and performance and that sort of thing. And basically, when you get a degree in performance of really any kind, they should pretty much just hand you a waiter's apron when they give you your degree. Because I went to New York and started working at a restaurant, and I was really fortunate in that in my 4 to 5 years living permanently in New York, I only worked at one place, which in the restaurant business is pretty much unheard of. And it was an amazing place. It was a 24-hour diner in the East Village. My first almost full year there, I was only working the midnight shift. So I'd work from midnight until 8 in the morning in the East Village in Manhattan, which is a spectacular spectacle of life that kind of comes in and out of that place. And it was this great place called Jaffa Cafe. It was decorated with velvet Elvis paintings and zebra print and like kind of oil dolphins. It was just the weirdest, coolest place. And I had a great time there. So that experience was wonderful, working as a server there. And eventually I became a manager there. But frankly, during that time there, doing a little performance here and there, but really, by the end of it, really just kind of floundering in a way. I had no direction, no real thought of what I was going to do. I was waiting for kind of something to just hit me and not really pursuing anything. And I was super fortunate that something actually did. So in 2008, I took a trip with my mom actually to the Galapagos Islands. And actually, this goes back to what I was saying earlier. When we were kids, my mom told my sister and I, if we graduated college, this was like when we were 5 or 6, that we could pick anywhere in the world we wanted to go, and she would take us. And so when I was like 6 or 7, I picked the Galapagos Islands. And when I graduated school a few years after, she was like, well, we've saved up enough. You want to take that trip? Let's go. And so I went to the Galapagos, and it was an incredible experience from a wildlife standpoint. But that was also where I had my first point and shoot camera. And I had no idea beforehand, but this is where I would fall in love with photography. And so I think over the course of that 7 or 8 day trip in 2008, I took probably 5,000 photos, somewhere around there. And probably accidentally, I know I accidentally deleted about 800 probably of them because I formatted my card like an idiot. And that was my first experience of photography and really falling in love with it and starting to play with it. And after that, back in New York, I started to get more interested in getting better cameras. So DSLR, lenses, understanding more about how to shoot in manual mode and sort of how photography really, really works. And then amazingly, later in 2008, I was still working at the restaurant, but an opportunity came up through my sister, through a gentleman that she knew named Alex Ross, who is now one of my best friends. And they knew each other, and he was at that time working for a small cruise ship company in New York that ran only small ship luxury cruises. And they were working with high-end alumni groups like Yale, Harvard, Stanford, big groups like Smithsonian, Nat Geo, National Trust, to take small groups of alumni travelers basically around the world. And they were looking for tour managers, and it's not really a job that you advertise for. It's sort of the kind of thing, it's all word of mouth. And my sister asked what it would be, what it's about. She thought I'd be good for it. And long story short, took a couple interviews with Alex. 3 weeks later, I was on a plane to Greece, and that was it for the next 6 years with that company. I was working primarily as a tour manager on small ship cruises. So cruises anywhere between 20 and 30 people to 100 people, all in educational travel. So these big alumni groups would send professors to lecture about, you know, the Greek antiquity sites that we were seeing, or World War II sites, or whatever it happened to be the theme of that cruise. We would have lecturers come along and excellent guiding, and it was a great way to see the world. And part of that job for us in the beginning was to take photographs and produce slideshows for the travelers at the end of every trip. So I had this love of photography, and then travel came into my life, and all of a sudden I was kind of doing them together, and you know, having to sort through 300 or 400 photographs every day and pick the best 20 or 30 to go into a slideshow. And I started producing all those things. You quickly wanted to get better at photography so that you didn't have 30 terrible images to throw out at the end of every night. So I started, you know, getting better and better. And that's kind of how those two things really came together for me. And that was in 2008, and then continued piece by piece up until today.
Right. And so, you know, getting into like natural photography and wildlife photography, we saw some of your images on your website, and they're amazing.
Thank you.
But then the question is then, for a lot of our audience, is, you know, how did you kind of transition into astrophotography? You know, where did that stem from? You know, how do you go from photographing frogs and, you know, the Amazon to taking pictures of the stars all across the world?
Yeah, one of the great things about moving beyond stuff like point and shoots and more sort of automatic, simple cameras is that it gives you much more flexibility into doing all sorts of different photography. So, you know, wildlife and this kind of stuff is really difficult to do with a point and shoot camera. You need someone with a high shutter speed, and you need zoom lenses and good quality and that kind of thing. And so even getting into what I now call terrestrial, most people call astrophotographers call terrestrial photography, right? Having a little bit better equipment and understanding the basics of it kind of get you to a point where you have flexibility to move around different kinds of photography. So for me, the first thing that really got me into looking at the night sky was wanting to simply shoot a night scene, stars over trees or a house or what have you, or the Milky Way. But the thing that really got me interested was the first time I saw star trail photos. So for those of you who are not maybe familiar with star trail photos, these are composite photos that are many different photos layered all together, taken over several hours, an hour or several hours, that show the apparent motion of the stars over a given course of time. And these were the kind of photos that are, I now know, relatively easy to do, actually. You don't need a ton of equipment for them, and the post-processing is fairly simple, but they're really eye-catching. And they get a lot of notice, and people wonder how you got them. And I think for me, it was great because it forced me to understand a little bit about how the night sky worked. It also shows you a little bit about what's going on, like our position in the universe and where the celestial pole is and how the sky is moving. And also, I just think it looks super cool photographically. So for me, that was the first real draw into astrophotography was looking at star trail photos and wanting to replicate them in some way.
And now, did you do this astrophotography alongside the tour groups you were given? Because you had mentioned that you would take pictures of the scenery and the landscapes of the places you'd visited and have those as slideshows. Was this like more of a side gig now that you're forming?
Yeah, so the early sort of stuff with astrophotography, and even now mostly, is just for me personally. You know, I do sell it, and occasionally I do workshops and what have you. But at that point, when I was doing stuff originally, particularly when you're out working, you know, as a tour manager, you are on. There's no start and stop time, right? If something happens at 5 in the morning, you're up and dealing with it, and so you are on and have to be presentable and with it and taking care of problems from whatever time in the morning until whatever time at night. And so the idea of staying up for 2 or 3 or 4 hours after dark somewhere really wasn't an option for me. So shooting anything that was astrophotography for me during work, that was really only if I was at the end of a program or before a program, when I was, you know, had a couple days on my own maybe. So this was really just stuff for me to do on my own, and kind of throw up on Facebook or Instagram, or maybe it was MySpace in those days. I have no idea. But, you know, just to share on social media or something of that nature to impress my friends, and really just hone my skills and get familiar with how to do different kinds of photography. Because, you know, no matter what you're doing as a photographer, even if you're not super interested in night photography or macro photography or wildlife, the more you do, the more it's going to help whatever you are interested in, because you just learn that much more about photography as an art and as a practice.
But by the sounds of it, you got into astrophotography kind of on your own and without a kind of mentor or a person who already knew how to do it. And so that must mean that you were largely a self-starter in that field.
Yeah.
And as someone who has tried to get into astrophotography since I have owned my first telescope when I was I think 12.
Yeah.
There's a lot of technical stuff and a lot of very
Right.
complicated stuff that exists out there.
Yeah.
So how did you kind of go on about the process of starting off on your own, given that you didn't really know these people who could teach you directly?
Yeah. I mean, thank goodness for the internet. I'll tell you what, because, you know, YouTube tutorials and internet, if you're willing to spend the time, you can learn just about anything. And that's really how I learned photography in general. DSLR photography, understanding how the exposure settings, you know, ISO, aperture, and shutter speed, how those things work together in order to compose a good photo. All of that was learned basically online, and then through my own experience. And eventually, when I worked with photo pros traveling and that sort of thing, you learn a lot of things from them as well. But for the most part, you know, it was really self-taught. Astrophotography for me was much the same way. And I would say that, you know, I think when you think about astrophotography, a lot of people automatically, I think like you, jump into the telescopes and cooled cameras and tracking and the Hubble type stuff, that the real deep space detailed astrophotography. And that is absolutely a part of it. And it's a part that I love and do. But that is jumping to the very highest level immediately in many
Right.
ways. And so I think for people who are interested, and the way that certainly I learned in most respects, are to really think about it in terms of levels of astrophotography, and kind of taking it slowly. So I think of astrophotography in sort of four different groups. The first would be a beginner level, which would be really starscapes. So simple stars over a house or a tree or what have you, a foreground object and stars above, maybe Milky Way, although Milky Way can be a little trickier to shoot. But and for that, really, you just need very basic equipment, right? A tripod, camera, lens, and the knowledge of how to shoot, basically. And that is absolutely accessible, and most people already have a camera and lens, or a lot of people do. So maybe just adding in a tripod would be something that you would need. And so in that way, fairly easy to learn online or various other places, and fairly accessible both in terms of cost and equipment. The next step up, which would be more of an intermediate, I think for me, uses almost all the same equipment, but that would be something like star trail photos, which really don't include much more equipment. You do need one extra little piece called an intervalometer, which sometimes are built into more modern cameras, but frankly, even if they are, they're limited. What I use is a little component that attaches to my camera, and it basically tells the camera, I want you to shoot X number of exposures the exposure length should be X number of seconds, and you should wait X number of seconds in between each exposure.
Right.
And then you can just set it, and it will run and run and run for hours, however long you tell it to, and it will take photo after photo after photo. And to do star trails and that sort of thing, that's all you need outside of that basic tripod, camera, lens, and an intervalometer. And then it's just a little bit of post-processing on the backside of that to create the image. And so for me, the learning of those two first steps, right? Basic starscapes and star trails, that I think if you have a basic understanding of photography and understand how to manipulate your camera in manual mode, those are really not terribly difficult. And you can find out how to do those fairly easily online. And by the way, I should stop here and say that anybody who's listening or watching and has questions, please contact me. You've got my website down there below. You can get in touch with me. I'm happy to help. As you can probably tell, I love talking about this stuff. So if you have questions and you're interested, please contact me. I'd be happy to get into it. The upper levels of astrophotography, levels 3 and 4, which involve more deep space astrophotography. Level 3 is really the same equipment: tripod, camera, lens, intervalometer, but you need to add in something called a star tracker. Or a mechanized mount. And essentially, this is a piece of equipment that sits on top of your tripod, and it allows you to, once you align it with the celestial pole, which once you know how to do it, it's very easy, it takes about 3 minutes. Once you do that, it will actually move your camera in time with the stars so that you can take much longer exposures and a ton of exposures together, which when you get into the upper levels of astrophotography, you need to do, particularly if you're photographing deep space objects, you need to do in order to bring out the details of those objects, because you're stacking many photographs on top of one another. And so even that, frankly, in terms of equipment, Star Tracker is only about $300 or $400, really not that expensive. But the kicker is the post-processing. You do need to, it's a pretty significant step up in the post-processing. And then the final step would be, the main telescopes, deep space, more Hubble stuff that you're seeing. And that really is an exponential step up at that point, because you're probably talking about cooled cameras, computerized mounts, a computer to run everything, filters, mono cameras, guide cameras, the whole 9 yards. It really can get out of hand pretty quickly. And, I actually did learn almost all of that online in a fevered month and a half or 2 months of just being obsessed with it, and really just studying basically until I kind of understood. But I had the basis in photography of things beforehand. And so I would certainly suggest anybody who's looking to go from 0 to that, you're very quickly going to be overwhelmed. So start at the lower levels and kind of work your way up would be my suggestion. And again, I want to make it abundantly clear that those lower sort of levels of astrophotography are really not technically difficult or financially inaccessible. They're there to be enjoyed and to be had, and you can do some really, really cool stuff with basically most of the equipment that a lot of people already have: tripod, camera, lens. That's it. So
maybe something that we should kind of drill down on is that astrophotography is not the same as photographing other stuff, in the sense that when you take pictures of stuff on land, you have enough, or even sometimes I would think too much light for your camera. Yeah. But when you're pointing a camera at the night sky, there's not enough light, and which is why you need to have, for example, longer exposure times to allow more light to get to the camera. And I think that's an interesting kind of divide between photographing stuff on Earth and photographing stuff in the sky, is that you have this kind of light divide that kind of changes the nature of how you take pictures. And so I assume that you can do post-processing for pictures that you take on land. But then how did you kind of get involved, or how does post-processing work for pictures that you take of the sky? because as I understand it, when you point a camera at the sky, you don't straight away just get a nice picture. You
Yeah.
get lots
Right.
of stuff, and then you have to do stuff to it, and then in the end, you get a nice picture. In fact, when we all took introduction to astronomy in Michigan, which is actually where we met, our professor called it digital massage. Um,
Yeah.
how
Yeah.
how how did you get into digital massage, and how did you learn how to do that, and what is it as well?
Yeah, so that's a complex question. There's a lot that goes into that, but I would start by saying that again, for people who are interested in it, those first couple levels, right? Basic astrophotography, starscapes over an object, or star trails, or even regular single shot Milky Way photos. You don't need to do any stacking of images for that sort of stuff, right? Generally speaking, you don't need to do that. The star trails, you are stacking photos, but that is to build the trails over time. The individual stars, you just take one shot and you have a beautiful star field. So
Right.
you don't really, and that's why that is much more accessible, both from an equipment standpoint and from just a learning standpoint. You can learn it much more easily online through those things. As you get into the upper levels again, you are having to make sure that you can track an object for a long time so that you can do longer exposures and that you can take many, many, many exposures. So you are right that the main difference between terrestrial photography and astrophotography is that you have a lot of light down here on Earth, generally speaking. And so most of the time you point your camera at the object you want, you take a photo, could be 1/4000th of a second that you're exposing for, or a 50th of a second, or whatever it is, but you've got your photo, you might do a little post-processing, and boom, you're done. When you are photographing galaxies or nebula or globular clusters or whatever it happens to be that are thousands or millions of light years away, they are super, super dim objects, most of them. And so you need to expose for far longer. So most individual astrophotography exposures would be generally, let's say, between 2 and 15 minutes for each exposure. And then you need to stack many, 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 many of those images on top of one another. And through the post-processing, what it does is it averages out all of the pixels, the individual pixels, it aligns them for each photo, and it averages out all those pixels, which essentially does something, it increases your signal to noise ratio. And being a theater major and an English major, signal to noise is not something that I had come to and understood as a concept until far later in life when I came to astrophotography. I know it's something that probably electrical engineers and you guys are very familiar with. But of course, the signal in an astrophoto is the good light. It's the light from the object that you want.
Mm-hmm.
And the noise in photography terms would be artifacts that are introduced from the camera sensor, from heat on the sensor, from long exposure, from when the information from the sensor is taken out of the sensor and put onto the memory card, it actually leaves artifacts there. And so there's all that noise in there as well. And by stacking the photographs, you actually, because you're averaging out the pixels, it gets rid of that noise and it boosts the signal. So the point of astrophotography, the main sort of, the reason that we go through all we do in order to get these photos is because you need to take many, many dozens or hundreds of photographs of the same thing, and then in post-processing, sort of stack them together. And then the post-processing is a very long sort of procedure, which comes at the end of another rather long procedure when you're talking about deep space, which is just the planning and actually acquiring of the images. But yeah, it's good to cover that first sort of base understanding of how astrophotography differs from terrestrial photography, because everything we do and the equipment that we use is all based around making sure that you can track objects in the sky for a long period of time. And also that you can go back to those objects within a few pixels and get the same photos night after night, as long as you need in order to get enough information to make a good photograph.
And so, oh, okay. Now, and so, you know, having all this extra equipment and all these other procedures that you have, How easy is it to mess up, and how difficult is it to actually get a final product?
Um, it is quite difficult. It's interesting because, you know, I think we'll talk a little bit about the actual procedure of going through and how we go from like starting to finishing. Once you're actually shooting, once you're out there, and in the case of deep space astrophotography, once your telescope is actually shooting, you're really not doing anything. The hard part is the planning and the setting up. The computer takes over, it tells the telescope where to go. You've already inputted all that information. You've done the hard work beforehand, and it is actually shooting. So in some ways, you know, it's really hands off, the actual shooting of it. That being said, you are taking things out into the field. In my case, I don't have a permanent setup, so I am setting up and breaking down stuff every single night. There's wind to contend with. There are clouds that are coming through. There are 20 wires going this way and that way, and connections, and things fail. And so there's a lot of things, you know, mechanical issues in the mount. There's a lot of things that can happen that can affect any given night of imaging. Once you get into a pattern of it, though, frankly, you know, most of the time it goes pretty flawlessly. There's always adjustments to be made. But certainly in the beginning, I mean, the first month and a half really of me shooting was just failure after failure after failure, really. And that was the best way to learn for me. Also because in doing deep space astrophotography, this really was for me, and I can't say I would really suggest this, although it's clearly possible. This was really me flying almost totally alone. I mean, I didn't have anybody else that was going out with me. You know, if I was able to take out somebody now and say, here's the setup, here's what you need to do. You need to polar align first, and then do this alignment, and then get your guiding going, and then start this, and this is how you do it.
Right.
That would have been a huge leg up. But that took me a month really of figuring out how to do this on my own. And so in the beginning, constant failure. I was thrilled after a month when, you know, I think I was able to get maybe 2 hours of photography done in a 7-hour, 8-hour night, right?
Right.
And now I go out and I set up, and if all goes well, I'm imaging for 7 hours out of an 8, you know, out of a possible 8 hours, 7 hours of it is imaging. And now I can do it without, I won't say without too much trouble, but in the beginning, certainly a lot can go wrong. And because you're dealing with things that are out of your control in many ways, mechanically, a lot can still go wrong. You just kind of, it's just part of the game, and it makes it much more rewarding when things go right and you finally get that image at the end that you know you put so much time and work into. And it's a great feeling. It really is a great feeling.
So,
and for listeners that are interested in getting involved with astrophotography but don't necessarily have the equipment, or they have a DSLR lying around the house from family vacations previously, are there certain things, this is kind of going back to the lower levels of astrophotography, but are there certain things they should look for in a camera? I know that one has to switch to manual mode, and it gets very intimidating when you have to configure all the different settings. When you go about selecting your targets at night, how do you figure out like your ISO value, your exposure length, and things like that? Or does it all depend on the target you're looking at?
Insofar as, so let's leave deep space astrophotography, the upper levels aside for the moment, and let's just talk about sort of level 1 and 2, starscapes, star trails, Milky Way, that sort of thing. Excuse me. With any kind of photography, of course, exposure settings, your aperture, your ISO, your shutter speed are all going to be dependent on your conditions, even at night. Some things to look for in terms of a camera, when you're just thinking about a camera and a lens. For any night photography, frankly, the newer cameras are cameras, DSLRs, or even they now call them mirrorless cameras, which are not point and shoot cameras, but they are more professional cameras that simply don't have the mirror that flips up in SLR cameras. The newer they are in the last 3 or 4 years, and really most mirrorless cameras are pretty new, they are much better at dealing with low light. And so they don't introduce as much sensitivity or as much noise into the image when you shoot at night, essentially. So newer cameras, generally speaking, frankly, are just better. And higher end DSLRs are better. That is not to say that you can't do some really nice photographs with mid to low range DSLRs. You can. I think the most important thing for somebody who is just starting out would actually probably be the lens. So the lens that you want to look for is a wide open aperture lens. So one that is relatively wide angle. So 12 millimeter up to 24, I would say, is probably a pretty good starting place. And then for those that understand aperture, f4 or below. And essentially, that's just saying that the aperture, the smaller the number in terms of the f number, actually the wider the aperture opening, and that allows more light to come in. So an f4 lens actually has a smaller hole than an f2.8 lens, which actually has a bigger one. So it gets a little confusing, but the wider the lens and the lower the f number, the maximum f number of the lens is what you're really looking for, because that will allow you to gather more light in a shorter amount of time. So I think those two things are important. A good DSLR, if you have access to one, and a wide angle lens that is what we call a fast lens. In terms of settings, again, that really depends on your camera and the conditions. Your ISO, generally speaking, with my camera, I do have, obviously, I have a pretty decent DSLR and some good lenses. I normally shoot at my ISO around 1600 to 3200, depending on what I'm shooting. The cameras nowadays, newer cameras, they go up to 25 and 3200 ISO, or 32,000, excuse me, 25,000, 32,000 ISO, which is unbelievable. It introduces quite a lot of noise and grain. So I like to keep something a little lower at 16 or 3200. I generally shoot with my aperture as wide open as possible, certainly when I'm doing my first shots, just to see what it's like. And then I'll try and close it just a little bit if I can, because you generally have a little bit better performance on the edges of your photograph when your aperture is just a little bit smaller than the maximum. And then the shutter speed, that depends totally on what you're going for. So if I'm going to do star trail images, I really don't care if the stars are trailing, so I'll shoot for 30 or 60 seconds because I'm going to be stacking all those images all together. But if I want pinpoint stars, then I have to consider how wide my lens is and what direction I'm shooting. There's a couple different things that you have to take into consideration to determine what your shutter speed is going to be, what your exposure length will be. And generally it's in the range of 10 to 20 seconds, somewhere around there. So, so that's really for basic, the basic levels of astrophotography, starscapes and star trails. When you get into the deep space astrophotography with a DSLR, so that would be sort of the level 3 that I was talking about, you do need a star tracker, of course, to do that, but you are still setting those manual settings in your camera. And again, I pretty much use the same settings insofar as ISO 16 to 3200, my aperture is wide open, but the exposure length would be set by the intervalometer. And so the exposure length at that point, I'm probably exposing for 2 minutes or 3 minutes or 5 minutes for a DSLR, something like that. I generally don't go above about 5 to 7 minutes for a DSLR to do deep space stuff. And then with the really deep space stuff with the telescope, you're not controlling ISO really. Most of the time you're using an astro camera, which is very different from a DSLR, and that's all done through a computer. You're really not setting ISO or any of that sort of stuff. You're letting a computer program. You input some of that information, but it's not done in the same format as DSLRs are. So I hope that gives at least I know it was rather confusing, I'm sure, for folks that might not be familiar with photography, but those that are a little bit, it gives you a little bit of a base, and just try and keep in mind that those lower levels, you're dealing with DSLR and those settings. Once you get up to deep space astro with telescopes, it's kind of a completely different game at that point, generally speaking.
Mm-hmm.
And how do you deal with light pollution? Because, light pollution is a problem, as we've been hearing more and more. It's on the news even sometimes.
Yeah.
And I guess there's a kind of a two-parter that comes out of that. How do you find a site that's dark enough?
Right.
How do you select the site intelligently? And then B, if you cannot find a place that's completely dark, as there are very few in the world, what kind of measures do you take to mitigate the effects of light pollution?
Yeah, it's a great question, because most of us live under light domes in cities. For a lot of the basic levels of astrophotography, starscapes, star trails, you actually can shoot in most skies. Star trails even you can do really with a full moon, and you're still going to get great star trails. So, you know, in Manhattan, you're probably not going to see many stars. So you do need to get away from the city a little bit if you're in a huge light dome like that. By the way, there are great resources online. I use something called lightpollutionmap.info, which will show you what the light pollution is like around you and in your area. And there's actually a scale of 0 or 1 to 9 called the Bortle scale, B-O-R-T-L-E, the Bortle scale, which will tell you a 9 is the worst, a 1 is the best, and it will tell you kind of where you are and what the skies and areas around you are. There's a couple other sites like that as well, Dark Sky Finder and that sort of thing. So those are great resources for people to find out where they can go. So for star trails and the other stuff, it helps to have darker skies, and it helps not to shoot around the full moon, but you can do stuff there. For deep space astrophotography, it's really kind of a complicated question because depending on your setup and what equipment you have, sometimes actually light pollution doesn't matter at all. And it really depends on your target and what you want to shoot. So I live in Philadelphia, and I set up when I was getting my setup, my telescope and deep space setup together, I knew that I was going to be shooting either from Philadelphia or very close to Philadelphia, because I can't drive out to super dark skies. The closest really dark sky is 5 hours from me. So I wanted a setup that I knew would be able to combat light pollution in some way, shape, or form. So when you are choosing to do deep space astrophotography, you have with astro specific cameras, you have a choice of shooting with a color camera, which is much like a DSLR in the sense that the sensor records in color, or you can shoot with a mono sensor, a black and white sensor, a monochrome sensor, and use filters in front of it, which you then have to combine in post-processing in order to make a color image. Now, it's much more work on the back end to shoot with a mono sensor, but it allows you to shoot with a range of different filters, many of which will almost wholly block out light pollution. So with a mono camera, I chose to do a mono camera and filters. And particularly if I'm shooting with what we call narrow band filters, they allow only a very narrow wavelength of light to come through. And these wavelengths are generally ones that are that you see in deep space objects like emission nebula and some galaxies. They block out most city light. So I have seen, I don't do this myself, but I have seen astrophotographers who are shooting with narrowband images from the middle of cities, literally on the rooftop in places like Philadelphia and Taiwan and various other places, or in Taipei and Taiwan. And they're able to get incredible images from basically Bortle 9, like the worst light pollution ever. So you can actually cut through depending on what you're shooting. However, some objects like galaxies, dark nebula, reflection nebula, globular clusters, essentially most things that are not emission nebula need to be shot with broadband filters, so red, green, blue filters, or with a color camera. And for that, dark skies really are necessary. You can use some light pollution filters in front of a color camera and really cut through some of the light pollution, but not a ton of it. And moonlight and light pollution are really things that, for those objects, it really helps to be in darker skies. So the question is not a simple yes or no. It depends on the object you're shooting, and it depends on the kind of setup that you have. In general, though, of course, the darker the skies, the better. And if you can shoot away from the full moon time, the better and easier it's going to be. Even with narrowband filters, that's generally pretty true.
I think one of the very cool things with astrophotography and the way that you got into it is that you're kind of walking a line, like a tightrope between more of a science and more of an art, and it's a cool combination of the two. Yeah. And you came from, I would think, more of the art side into it, and then all of this science stuff got unloaded onto you.
Yeah.
Did you have a hard time adjusting to learning about all of these things, broadband filters, all of these wavelengths, what emission nebulae versus the galaxies and stuff like that are, or did that just kind of come naturally?
No, it did not come naturally. You know, I think the if you want to learn something and you have a great enough passion to learn it, then learning what you have to learn in order to do that thing is something that you're willing to do. You know, if I can't imagine dragging somebody, particularly from my background, through this if they didn't want to do it. I mean, it would just be nuts. So I think you have to have a passion to want to learn it. And I did, and I do now find it very interesting learning about the difference between reflection and dark nebula and planetary nebula and galaxies and you know, globular clusters and open clusters and those sort of things. I think for me, one of the things that I found really helpful was particularly in stuff like narrowband imaging, right? So when you are imaging with narrowband, you're getting the image that you produce in the end is what they call a false color image, because really we don't see these wavelengths that the narrowband light is coming into you, is passing through to the filter, excuse me, the narrowband filter is passing through to the sensor. And so we don't see it in the wavelengths that it's passing through. And so when you make a narrowband image, you can assign that data to any color and in any way that you want to. So you could end up with a blue and green image, or a red and yellow image, or a purple and whatever. It's really and to me, that's great, because the artist in you gets to come out a little bit at that point. You get to play with it and you get to see it. And that helped me, coming from an artistic background and like wanting to express myself a little bit in that, to be able to manipulate that stuff and learning about it and having to go through the understanding of it. I knew there would be not only the payoff of a great photo at the end, but also the artistic enjoyment of being able to manipulate that and play with it. And it's one of the things I love most, is learning, you know, and having fun with color combining at the end. You know, with the broadband targets like galaxies and dark nebula and reflection nebula, which you're really going more for scientific accuracy, if you want to call it that, because you're recording things the way that our human eyes would see them. So they are true color images. And so you don't want to make them wildly different necessarily from what we see. I enjoy the art of being able to get it right, but there's not that artistic expression and sort of being able to go, I'm just going to do something crazy with this, you know, with this rendition of this photo. So frankly, I enjoyed learning it because it got me to be able to do something that I really enjoy doing, which is the artistry of it, and then having this beautiful photo at the end that I could share and enjoy myself. So while it was difficult at times and confusing at times, it all paid off because it was something that I enjoyed doing. And frankly, there's also a piece of it that sometimes you don't have to understand the why to understand that it works, right? So sometimes you go out there and you're like, I don't really understand exactly what these narrowband filters are doing, but I know that it gets me a great photo in the end. And so, you know, you don't have to understand all the why of it necessarily before. You do have to understand the how, and you do have to understand what targets are best shot with what filters. And that in and of itself is a learning curve, but not necessarily all that difficult, right?
Right.
And as Joe mentioned, it's very poetic how astrophotography is kind of that bridge between the science of space and also the art of space, and the beauty of it. And I was wondering, since you're approaching it from a more artistic perspective and gaining more scientific knowledge as you've like gotten more into astrophotography, if I know some like amateur astronomers and astrophotographers have kind of taken more of a science approach, where they're actually doing research with it, where they're like tracking comets or near Earth objects, or even supernova. And I was wondering if that's something you've ever considered getting involved with yourself.
You know, I haven't. So for me, the love of it is really the imaging. So I am embarrassed to say I barely ever use my telescope for observing. And so in large part because I have to undo a lot of the optical equipment in order to observe. And every time you do that, you know, there's things that can go wrong. And so I'm a little bit hesitant. But for me, I do know astrophotographers, even unintentionally, who just in shooting things from year to year, shooting the same objects, have noticed a supernova that somebody never caught before, or what have you. And I know some astrophotographers that are doing that specifically and are really interested in the science of it outside of the imaging part of it. That is not something that for me I find super interesting yet, but it's in sort of the back of my mind that at some point that is something that I would like to be a part of. And there are teams of astrophotographers, I'm sure you well know, all over the world, who are much more in research, but are also using amateur astrophotographers who are amateur scientists in many ways, but are very serious about what they do and working in teams to survey parts of skies and image things over and over in order to look for irregularities, whether it be supernovae or comets or meteors or what have you, odd things that are happening, which may not be picked up by the bigger agencies and research teams and that sort of thing.
And so you had sent us a few of your pictures actually, and we kind of wanted to know which one was the most challenging to take and which ones were the most fun to take.
Oh, all right. Yeah. Well, let's take a look for those that that I think are looking on YouTube. I think.
Yeah, we'll put them up on the screen. Yep.
Yeah, exactly. So for me, starting from the beginning, the first couple photos, the North America and Pelican nebulas that you see there, and the Orion Nebula, which is a black and white. So these two images are narrowband images. And for me, these are images that I think express the joy for me in many ways of astrophotography. They are the things that got me into wanting to understand and learn astrophotography, because bright nebula like this are really fun to photograph, and they're beautiful to look at, and being able to make images like these, I think, are the things that I love the most. It's something that I think engages people, and it certainly engaged me. And so these are images that I think were special for me to take in many ways, because they were things that drew me in. I would say in terms of difficulty, they all have the challenges. I think we've got 6 or 7 images here that we're going to look at. They all have their distinct challenges. I would say that, for the North America and Pelican Nebula, which was the first photo, I think, that was up, that is a photo that took me over 2 months to take, and includes about 40 hours worth of actual exposures, and I probably threw away an additional 6 to 8 hours of photographs that weren't good enough. And so the challenge for that one was simply the amount of time that it took to do it. And then the processing probably took me about 15 hours or so to process that photo all told. And, I'm still working on it and still want to do different things with it. So, so that was the challenge of a photograph like that. I can't say that it was the most difficult in some ways. I think there are some others that I would find more difficult, and I'll explain that when we see them. The Orion Nebula photograph, the second one there that you see, I like that because I love monochrome images. It's black and white. You get to see a lot of the detail. It is a stunningly beautiful nebula. And I like this because this image shows just the one narrowband emission line. So this is just the hydrogen alpha emission line. So this is a wavelength of light that is mostly in the red. It is a wavelength that we would generally see as red, but our cameras and our eyes don't really pick it up all that well. So you're seeing just one part here of what would become a false color image, but this shows you what a particular nebula is emitting in that wavelength. And I just think that's super cool. When you see it with the other, oxygen and sulfur wavelengths, you sort of see how a nebula is composed of different wavelengths of light. And that I think is really quite cool. And I just think this is a beautiful, beautiful image.
I think there are 2 really, really cool things about that. I think the first is that it's pretty awesome that someone with a camera and a telescope is able to not only look at a nebula, but see the different elements or the different things that are actually in the nebula based on the kind of light that it's sending us.
Right.
But then what's even cooler is that the three of us we sometimes help the Student Astronomical Society at Michigan run open houses. And so what those are is there's at least a somewhat sizable telescope on the roof. And just anyone from the public can come and, look at cool stuff through it.
Right.
And the Orion Nebula is often something that we default showing people because it's in a good place in the sky, and you can see, it's kind of interesting to see it. But the amusing thing is that what we show people when they look through their eyepiece is just a fuzzy thing that's green, and they really can't see anything more than that. Whereas it's no way near as good as what you can see in this picture. And I think it's super cool that with intelligent ways of taking pictures and kind of really cool ways of looking at an object through a telescope, which I assume cannot be bigger than the one on the rooftop, you can get an image as cool as that one.
Yeah. I mean, I'm glad you feel that way. I certainly do as well. And I think that's one of the things that I love so much about astrophotography is I think it makes space and what is in space and the beauty, the absolute stunning beauty of our galaxy and our universe, much more accessible when you get to see these images and you go, yeah, that little fuzzy dot up there, this is what it actually looks like, right? And it certainly makes me look up with more wonder, knowing that it's there, even though I can't see it with my eyes necessarily, more than maybe a fuzzy dot. Being able to know that it is up there and what it looks like in detail, to me, makes my engagement with the night sky and my understanding and enthusiasm for space that much stronger. And no, my telescope is a 4-inch refractor, so I am sure that whatever you have on that on the ceiling,
0.4 meters, yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So no, I mean, this was all with a 4-inch refractor. It's a relatively small 102 millimeter. It's a relatively small scope. So it is pretty amazing what you can get through this image stacking and with all the processing and that sort of thing that goes in with astrophotography. Sure.
And then one thing I've found, I'm sure maybe you've found the same thing, since you did mention you don't necessarily always look through the telescope, just stick with the camera. But when I was a kid, I would always look through the telescope and see like a fuzzy Jupiter or a fuzzy galaxy and be really interested. Yeah. But I don't think I'll ever be able to look through a telescope again and be interested, just after seeing like images like this that you take, or even images from the Hubble Space Telescope or things we see in class.
Yeah.
Just because of how beautiful it is, like up close instead of as a fuzzy object in the telescope.
It's a weird thing because I find that I feel exactly the same way, right? I look at objects when I've looked at the Orion Nebula in my own scope, or if I look at the Pleiades or something of that nature, because I know what it looks like in photographs that I've taken. I'm kind of like, oh, well, that's a bit disappointing, and it shouldn't be disappointing, right? It should be incredible. And I think when you actually, the one thing I will say is that for me, because I don't do any planetary imaging, it's actually, people go, oh, well, can you take a photo of Jupiter? It is very different from taking most other deep space object. It's a completely different kind of photography. When I see even the minuscule little, there's tiny in my scope, but when I see Saturn or Jupiter in my scope, just with my eye, just seeing the rings of Saturn with your own eyes is pretty incredible. Still for me, I still get that like, moment when I see it.
Right.
But that being said, once you've seen it a couple times, are you going to work that hard to have that view, like to go out and set up everything and blah, 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 just to get that view? For me, no, it's not that interesting. And I find that frankly a little bit disappointing. I think it should be magnificent every time we see these things, but that is just part of it. So, yeah, once you see the night sky like this, it's hard to sometimes to be enthusiastic about just seeing what you see observing. Although I think with the right sky conditions and with a little bit of help from, even observing, you can get filters that will show a little bit more of, they'll block out light pollution or show a little bit more of the hydrogen or oxygen or this kind of thing, wavelength. You can get some pretty amazing views, but listen, your eye is only going to see what your eye can see at any one moment. Whereas when you're taking a photograph that is 40 hours of exposure, it's just not, your eye can't compete really. So it's always going to be a little bit of a disappointment in that sense.
Yeah, and I think what makes it even more special is all the artistry that you're able to put in afterwards. For example, images 3 and 4 here of the Horsehead Nebula and Pinwheel Galaxy, how you've incorporated these different colors based on different filters.
Yeah, so the images 3 and 4 here, the Horsehead and the Pinwheel, I would actually say these for me are more difficult in some ways to shoot than the narrowband imaging, which are 1 and 2, because these are actually shot with broadband filters primarily. So the Horsehead in particular presents a really interesting challenge, because the Horsehead is the little dark nebula that you see that looks like a horse's head or the head of a seahorse on the right-hand side there. Quite famous. I think a lot of people might have seen it. And it is a dark nebula. So it's a nebula that is really only seen because of the light of other nebulas or stars behind it, right? So if there wasn't that stuff behind it, we wouldn't really be able to see this. It's essentially a thick dust cloud that we just see the silhouette of. But the Flame Nebula, which is in the center left, which is that bright yellow object with sort of black sort of veins running through it, that is an emission nebula. And so this particular photograph actually requires you to shoot both regular broadband filters, red, green, blue, in order to get the stars and the dark nebula, the Horsehead. And then to really get, and some of the Flame Nebula will come through in that as well. But in order to really get the definition in the Flame Nebula, as well as that red hydrogen that's just floating off there in the background behind the Horsehead, that really requires narrowband filters, hydrogen filters, in order to do that. And so this is an image that is very famous. A lot of astrophotographers will take it. And there are better images than this one out there for sure. But in order to do it even this amount of justice, you really need to be able to combine shooting true color images and combine it with narrowband imaging as well. So from that standpoint, this image is a difficult one in some ways to combine at the end. It takes a decent amount of skill and processing in order to put it together in the end. And that's stuff that, thankfully, another part I love so much about astrophotography is I'm always learning how to do those things a little bit better. The Pinwheel Galaxy, number 4, the 4 image there, that is a difficult image in many ways because the object is so small from my telescope and my field of view. Keep in mind that when you're shooting with a telescope, there's really no zoom, right? So it's a fixed focal length. I can shoot what I can squeeze into my frame or stitch frames together, but with an object like this, when you're shooting something that is relatively small in my field, for my field of view, like a galaxy, you need to gather a lot of light because it's dim, so it takes a long time in order to get any detail out of it. And also, you can't really enlarge it a ton, or else you're going to lose a lot of detail and resolution. So for me, this is a difficult, any of these galaxies, apart from the Andromeda Galaxy, which is a very large one, most galaxies are difficult things for me to shoot and require really good quality data in order to get detail out of a relatively small object like this. So difficult for 2 different reasons, but a joy and a challenge to process regardless.
And when you go about selecting what target you want to focus on for a night or a few nights, do you draw inspiration from other astrophotographers you find online, like Instagram, or are these things you've always wanted to take a picture of and now you have the time to?
Yeah, it's a great question. Certainly other people, astrophotography is actually a great community. There are a ton of resources online, both for just finding out things, in terms of how to do things. So again, people contact me. I'll be happy to share a ton of online resources. Also in Instagram, there's a great astrophotography community of people, sharing what they shoot, and also generally also sharing all the technical details of how they shot it. So what equipment they're using, how long the exposure was, what filters, so on and so forth, that kind of thing. And that gives you a lot of great ideas as to what you might want to shoot yourself. That being said, you see a ton of things, particularly like say from astrophotographers in the Southern Hemisphere, that guess what? You're just never going to be able to shoot up here. And so you shoot what you can shoot based on your location and the time of year a little bit. And then there are things like the Orion Nebula, like the Horsehead Nebula, like Andromeda Galaxy, which if you've had even a passing interest in space, the Pillars of Creation from the Eagle Nebula, right? The famous 95 Hubble telescope photo that I think all of us have seen. No matter how much you've ever watched astrophotography, seeing those kind of things, you think, yeah, I want to shoot that one day. And so no matter your setup, you want to get a little piece of that, no matter what it is. So it's a little bit of a combination of all of those things. But part of that goes into how you are going to set up shooting, which if you want to go through that quickly, I can go through the process of sort of how I set up a night of shooting and then what that looks like a little bit.
Yeah, that would be fantastic.
Yeah. So the last thing I would do is just very quickly, I just wanted to point out the last two images that I sent to you guys for 5 and 6 before we get into things. I just wanted to point out these images in particular, not because they are particularly beautiful images, although of course I took them, so I do like them. But I also wanted to point out to any viewers that these are images that were taken with a DSLR, a lens, a tripod, and a tracker, and that's it. So these are not telescope. You don't need a ton of crazy fancy equipment for this sort of stuff. These are images that with a little bit of massaging, digital massaging, post-processing, and some equipment, you could actually take yourself with, I don't want to say relative ease, but it is certainly not the adventure that telescopes and cooled cameras and all the rest of this stuff is. You know, a good DSLR, a decent lens, a tracker and knowing how to use that, a steady tripod, an intervalometer, and a little bit of post-processing. And these kind of images are within your reach. Maybe not immediately, but I just wanted to point out that, you know, these kind of things, which are deep space objects, these are deep space objects, are available to folks. So I just wanted to throw that out there quickly. Hopefully that whets the appetite for some aspiring astrophotographers out there.
Right.
So insofar as just very quickly, I suppose, or kind of briefly, the process for doing deep space astrophotography, excuse me. You know, like I said earlier, this is a process in which you do most of the work before you actually go out there. So astrophotographers almost never go out not knowing what they're going to shoot. You know, you go out with a plan in place, and in the case of a big telescope and everything else, like the deep space stuff that I do, everything is run by a computer, and therefore the computer program that you're using to run everything, you need to input all that information ahead of time. So if I'm selecting a new target, and don't forget that I might be working on a target off and on for a week, 2 weeks, a month, 2 months, you know, when I'm selecting a new project, the first thing I would do is go into a program like Stellarium, which you might be familiar with, which is a desktop or even a phone-based, app-based, but for this part, I would absolutely use the desktop planetarium, essentially. And you can select your location, the time of day, any time of year, what have you. It will show you what the night sky is going to look like. You can select an object and see when that object rises, falls, how high it's going to get, when it passes, you know, when it transits from east to west, so on and so forth. Importantly, also for astrophotographers, you can also input your telescope, your camera, and any other information you want, and it will actually give you the frame of your camera and what your field of view is going to be. And so that way you can then say, this object is going to fit well into my field of view. You can rotate it, see what it looks like. So that way it help you select what object you want to shoot and how long you want to shoot it for, and so on and so forth. So I'll use a program like that to maybe select what I want. And then the great thing about Stellarium is that it will also give you all the information that you need in terms of how long is this object going to be up over the next few months? Is it setting more quickly? Do I need to get to it more quickly, or do I have months and months and months to shoot it? Is this an object that is, circumpolar? Is it always going to be available for me to shoot throughout the year? So these are the things that Stellarium can really kind of help you decide with. So once I have a target in mind, then I would move over to my sequencing program, which I use a program called Sequence Generator Pro. There are a few different programs that you can use. And this is unfortunately, well, for me, I'm a Mac user, but almost all of these programs are Windows-based programs. So I have a Windows laptop that I use exclusively for astrophotography, and I move over there to Sequence Generator Pro, and you basically start a new sequence, and you would load it up and say, this is what I want to shoot. It searches through its database. It brings up the object that you want to shoot. You get to frame it, so you have exactly how you want it. It takes note of the RA and dec positions, so the right ascension and declination, which for those who don't know are kind of like latitude and longitude in the sky. It's a fixed position in the sky. It takes note of that, and it takes note of the camera angle that you want, and it basically writes a sequence for you, memorizes that, and then it gives you an option of how you want to shoot this thing. So do you want to use red, green, blue? Do you want to use narrowband images? How many do you want to take? What is the break in between? It's essentially the program that sets everything up. So you input all that information, and then once that's done, you take that out into the field. And once you get everything set up at night in the field, you set up your telescope, all the power that comes with it. I have 3 different batteries that I use to run my computer, all the equipment. It takes me about an hour to set it up from nothing into getting ready to go. And that includes the polar alignment of the mount. So making sure that the right ascension alignment is right at the celestial pole, so that the mount rotates in time with the stars. And then also getting the telescope itself aligned in the night sky. So you pointed at about 4 different stars. So the telescope knows where it is, it knows it's polar aligned, and then you can actually start shooting. And at that point, the computer program pretty much takes over everything. So I click a button, it does the guiding, it does the focusing, it will, if I'm switching targets, it'll do all that. It's basically out of my hands at that point. I'm just a monitor. And so if all goes well, after an hour of setting up to shoot that night, hopefully I don't touch it for the rest of the night. That's if all goes well. You have to do a little bit of adjusting here and there, but that's it. And then, the images will feed into your computer. They're saved onto a hard drive. You go back home. At the end of the night, you might do some really brief sort of post-processing to it, some initial stuff just to get it ready for later post-processing. But of course, for most of my images, I'm shooting for at least 4 or 5 or 6 nights. So it's not as if I'm going and post-processing all of these images every single night. I kind of do a little bit to get them ready for when I have all the data collected together, and then I'll take a day or two after I have all that data to really go through and do all the post-processing to get to a final image. So for me, that is sort of the process of going out to image on any given night. And how I shoot and what I shoot per night, of a given object will depend greatly on the moon, how high it is in the sky, what sort of object it is, if I'm shooting broadband or narrowband or that sort of thing. So it changes quite a lot. So that is the process, which I hope doesn't scare anybody off at the end. I enjoy the process of it, but it is something that you need to be rather dedicated to do because particularly for me, I can't shoot in my backyard because I don't really have one. I have to drive 35 minutes out, do an hour of setup, shoot, break down at the end of the night, and drive back home in order to do it all. So it's a labor of love, but I do love it. So.
Joe, I think you're muted.
Oh, sorry. Are you guys not able to hear me?
No, we could hear you. It was Joe.
Oh, okay.
Joe. Yeah.
Oh,
I think one last very interesting question. Which is the picture that you're proudest of?
I think I'm probably always proudest of my most recent image, generally speaking, because it's the one that I've spent the most time on recently. And also, frankly, in the first few years of doing this, every time you process, you're going to get better and better and better at it. And so I look at the images that I did earlier when, frankly, I only had 2 hours of data or 3 hours of data, and I was just so excited to have this image that I couldn't wait to process it, and I did it. And now I have a little bit more patience, and I'm spending, like I said, sometimes up to a month or two where I'm shooting, different things, but it may take me 2 months to complete an image, and I'll spend 40 hours of shooting on one image. So that first image that we threw up on the screen, the North America and Pelican, for me, that's one of my best works in terms of processing. And I think the color and the transition between colors and just sort of the feel of it is something that I really love. And I think it shows it's a fairly common object for astrophotographers to shoot. But for me, it's something that I'm very proud of in terms of what I have been able to shoot, just from the amount of work that went into it and the end result that for me, I think accurately reflects the amount of work that went in. But as I said, there are things that I love about most of the photographs that I take. So everyone loves the things they create. So,
Right.
but that one has a special place in my heart, I have to say. So.
And now that we're or have been in quarantine, I assume you've been spending a lot of more of your time focusing on strictly astrophotography. And I was wondering, once you're able to travel the world more with the tour groups, do you think you'll focus back on wildlife photography and terrestrial photography, or kind of gear more towards this space?
Yeah, great question. I mean, I have been, on my website, you'll see a ton of different kinds of photography, travel stuff and wildlife and night sky. My Instagram, because it's what I've been shooting recently, is pretty much totally night sky photography at this point. You have to flick back a ways to get back into the nature stuff and the travel stuff. I have been doing much more astrophotography, which for me has been really great. I mean, quarantine has been terrible in many ways. I am out of work because I work in the travel industry, of course.
Right.
But it's also the first time in over 10 years that I've spent more than a month in one place constantly. So for me, being able to enjoy some of the routine of being in one place has been really nice. And then being able to practice astrophotography regularly, right? So instead of being home for 2 or 3 weeks, you get 5 nights of shooting in, because of course you can't shoot on cloudy nights or if it's too windy or this or that. So everything has to be right. And now being able to go much more regularly, my abilities have increased quite a lot. I've had much more chance to process and practice, which has been lovely. When I start traveling again for work, when I'm out leading groups, I am leading photographic groups, and part of what we do sometimes will be night photography. And so I'll get to practice that in some locations where, I take folks all over the world. So when we're in Namibia, super dark skies, the most beautiful skies I've ever seen are in Namibia. We take people to Norway to do northern lights photography, some places in India as well where there's not much light pollution. We get to do dark sky stuff, but a lot of it would be in more cultural photography, travel photography, wildlife stuff, Antarctica, Easter Island, Morocco, Bhutan, these kind of places. You're not necessarily doing night sky stuff. So I will do whatever is in front of me at that point. I mean, I'm very much an opportunistic shooter, and I like to shoot all sorts of different stuff, but I think astrophotography is really my passion. If I could have a perfect life photographically, I would probably be in Botswana or in Namibia or somewhere in Eastern Africa, safaris where I could do safari shooting during the day, and then be somewhere so far away from light pollution that I could do some spectacular night stuff at night. And that would probably be like heaven for me. But as it is, I live in Philadelphia, and I don't often, I'm in Africa a couple times a year generally, but I take advantage of what and when I can. And wildlife doesn't always have to be spectacular. You can go into your backyard and find some pretty cool stuff. So photography for me is opportunistic in many ways, but astrophotography is a deep love and something that I will work very hard to get. And one of the things that I do love about it is that this small setup, in fact, the same setup that those last 2 photographs that we showed, that is something that you can stow and take with you. So, I mean, I can take my camera, my lens, my tripod, my intervalometer, and my star tracker, because they're fairly small. And if you're willing to put up with a few extra pounds in your bag, then, 5 extra pounds in your bag for that star tracker, you can go out and do deep space stuff even from the southern hemisphere, where I can shoot objects that I wouldn't be able to shoot up north. So I will continue to shoot everywhere in the world as much as I can, even if it's not with my big setup.
Right. And then I guess one last question would be then, what is one astronomical object that you haven't been able to photograph yet, but you really want to? It's like your big time goal.
So amazingly, actually, I have photographed it with my DSLR. It was the very first deep space object I ever photographed, was the Andromeda Galaxy. And it is spectacularly beautiful and gigantic. But it was the first thing I ever photographed when I got into it. And then I didn't really get back. I didn't feel comfortable shooting it again with my big setup, my telescope, until it was too late to shoot it in the year. And it was setting too early and it was too low. So it's starting to rise again. And I am really looking forward to, in the near future, shooting Andromeda again. I'm actually moving in September, I'm moving from Philadelphia to Utah, in part specifically to get to dark skies. And because it's a galaxy, that's a broadband target, which means I have to shoot it in the darkest sky possible with red, green, blue filters. And so I'm basically waiting until I can get out to Utah to shoot that object. And I'm really looking forward to having a spectacular photo of Andromeda, even though my setup is almost the field of view. It's going to take up the entire thing, basically. So I'm really looking forward to that. The other object I would say that I didn't even know existed, but that I absolutely want to shoot, if any of you guys are in the Southern Hemisphere, listeners who might be in the Southern Hemisphere, there is the most stunning nebula called the Great Carina Nebula, or the Great Nebula in Carina, which is unbelievably beautiful and has so much stuff in it and around it that the next time I'm in the Southern Hemisphere, although I won't have my big setup, the first thing I'm going to shoot is that object. And I didn't even know that object existed 2 or 3 years ago, but I've seen a ton of photographs of it, and that would be the next thing that I would really want to shoot. So there are some goals in mind, one of which I'm going to have to do a little traveling to find.
And you had also mentioned previously that you have an upcoming masterclass or like a lecture series on photography, or is it more specifically astrophotography? And how can someone listening get a hold of those?
Yeah, thank you. Well, first of all, I should mention, the travel company that I work for is called Open Sky Expeditions, and it's with my buddy Alex, who hired me into the travel business, and we do photo trips together. Some of them focus more on night sky, but as I said, some of them are wildlife and cultural photography, or going to Antarctica, which is just an incredible experience, Easter Island, these kind of things. So if you're interested in travel photography, that is a bunch of different things. Again, Open Sky Expeditions, you can find some information on my website, also at openskyexpeditions.com. I will be teaching a class on introductory basic astrophotography. So for somebody who is familiar with their camera, is relatively comfortable shooting maybe in manual mode, or could think they could do that, and wants to learn how to do basic nightscapes. So I was talking really about those first 2 levels of astrophotography. So starscapes, stars over an object, and star trail images. I'll actually be teaching a course through a company called Unique Photo, who are based in New Jersey. I also have a shop here in Philly, and they're one of the largest East Coast sort of camera universities, I suppose. And this will be an online course, will take place over the course of 5 weeks, hour and a half per week, where we will basically walk through everything, the basics, equipment that you'll need, how to shoot, settings, how to process basic photos, star trails, and what other kinds of media you can make with those photos. Things like time lapses, for instance, can be shot from the same frames that you use to make a star trail photo. So that's what we'll be talking about, and that is through Unique Photo. I hope we'll have an updated link for you by the time that folks are listening or watching this. And it would be great to see anybody there. If you want to learn how to do some basic astrophotography, that's exactly what we're going to be covering.
Awesome. Well, thank you for taking the time out of your Monday today to talk with us and, inform us on your background, how you got involved in astrophotography and what exactly astrophotography is. I'm sure everyone listening is a lot more informed, as we are, on what astrophotography is and how it can affect the current scientific climate.
Yeah, and thank you so much. And again, for those listening, all the links below, if you're interested, can be found in the description, whether that be listening on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or YouTube.
Great.
And
Well,
websites and Instagram.
Yes.
you guys, thank you so much. It was a great pleasure speaking with all of you. And again, I just want to repeat, if anyone has any questions, please don't hesitate to reach out. I clearly love talking about this stuff, and I'm happy to help. So thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to chat with you guys. And I look forward to all your future podcasts.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, guys, take care.
Bye-bye.
Hey everyone, thank you for listening to this podcast episode. This is Michael.
This is Sam.
This is Tommy.
And this is Joe.
If you're listening to this on YouTube, make sure to like, subscribe, and share with your friends. And if you're listening on Apple Podcasts or Spotify, make sure to leave a review. All of the show notes can be found either in the description below or on our website. Thank you again for listening, and we'll see you next week with more Everything Astronomy.